Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Tim. I'm a historian here at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates. Thanks for joining me today for my special step into history, Ford and Fort Myers, a legacy for the people. We're going to take a look at Henry Ford and some of the things he did here locally in Fort Myers, and what are some of the reasons why his name and his legacy are carried on here by our museum. Of course, Henry Ford, born 1863, passed away in 1947, and he left a mark down here in Fort Myers. Henry Ford's legacy began even before he ever stepped foot into the town of Fort Myers. Joseph Walton Hill signed a deal to sell 24 automobiles in 1910 locally here in Fort Myers. Hill and Company began running ads to sell Fords in early 1914. It was located on 2nd Street. They were the first to sell new Ford vehicles in Fort Myers. So they had a relationship with the Ford Motor Company before Henry Ford ever came here. Now, another thing that happened was Henry Ford became extremely famous right before he came down to Fort Myers for the very first time. And he did that by announcing his $5 workday on January 5th, 1914. Henry Ford announced a minimum $5 salary for all eligible employees working 8-hour days. It was conceived as a profit-sharing plan, which would motivate Ford employees to adopt efficient and productive habits at both the factory and the home. And you can see in the photograph there, this created a huge problem in Detroit in January. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded the city to take advantage of Henry Ford's new $5 workday. So he became instantaneously put Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company on a higher level as far as the automobile industry went. Now, eventually, after being invited by his close friend Thomas Edison, Henry Ford would come to Fort Myers. He was invited down here to go hunting and fishing with his good friend Edison. He brought his wife Clara, his good friend John Burroughs, and his son Edsel. They all came down here. Now, this created a huge local buzz here. 2,000 people greet the famous friends at the depot. As a matter of fact, they planned these ceremonies for a month in advance. They were planned by the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade planned a welcoming party for the famous automotive manufacturer. They were going to set this procession off with a 31-car procession made up of Ford automobiles owned by local citizens. It was headed by 3 Model T touring cars purchased by Henry Ford. These were the cars to be used during their stay in Fort Myers on their camping trip and other various activities. Hill and Company provided the Model Ts for the celebrities. Mr. Edison's car was driven by Kinsey Everett. John Burroughs joined Edison in the parade. Henry Ford's car was driven by Mr. Owens. He drove Henry, Clara, and Charles Edison. Most prominent citizens participated in the parade. Mayor Matson, E. Goodnow, Mr. Hanson, just to name a few. So this was a big deal when Henry Ford arrived. That's about the entire population of Fort Myers at the time. Now, while Henry Ford was in town on that first visit, Henry Ford prided himself on doing things the right way. While he was in town, he secured an automobile license from H.A. Bly, county tax collector. This gave Ford the right to use his car over the streets and around the environs of Fort Myers and Lee County. It also states in the article there that Ford was accompanied by one of Edison's sons. And I believe that was Charles, because we have several photographs of Charles driving the cars during the camping trip. So Henry Ford and Charles Edison, they go get their driver's license here in Fort Myers. And while they're on vacation, the Ford and Edison families went on a short camping trip to Deep Lake. That's just about in between Immokalee and Everglades City, or Route 41, just south of Immokalee. This is a picture of their 5-car caravan headed to Deep Lake. They set off from Seminole Lodge on February 28th, and you can see they have 3 Model Ts and 2 Cadillacs. So they weren't sentenced to driving Model Ts only on that trip. And after their 2-day Everglade jaunt, the friends enjoyed their time soaking in the warm sun and local ambiance of Fort Myers from Seminole Lodge. So we have an array of pictures here in our museum. These are just a few, some of the activities that you did for fun in Fort Myers. Most of it involved physical exertion because there wasn't a whole lot to do in those days while you're in Fort Myers. And lucky for Henry Ford and Mr. Edison and Burroughs, they loved the outdoors. They loved to go hunting. They loved to go fishing. So this is some of the activities that you would see them doing on their camping trip. And then while they were here, I want to point out, they went all the way up to Lake Okeechobee one day on a steamship ride. I believe they used the Menge Brothers steamship, the Ada May at the time. And we have a picture of them getting off of the Ada May on the Edison's Pier. So this is right here on our property. On March 10th, Ford and Burroughs left Fort Myers after they stopped by the Andrew D. Gwynn Institute and gave a talk to high school students and visited every class. Edison and his guests had just returned from a 2-day excursion up the Caloosahatchee River on the Ada May. Now, the Andrew D. Gwynn building was built in 1911 at the corner of 2nd and Jackson. This was the pride and joy of Lee County's educational system at the time. It was named for Colonel Andrew D. Gwynn, a wealthy Tennessee cotton broker and grocer whose family contributed $8,000 towards its construction. On October 19, 1911, the Andrew D. Gwynn Institute opened its doors as a fully accredited state-of-the-art school that the entire community was extremely proud of. It housed 10 rooms, a principal's office, a library, a spacious 500-seat auditorium, 4 restrooms, water fountains, and heat by radiation. Its enrollment that first year was 285 students, grades K through 12. And if you take a stroll down 2nd Street today, this building is still standing there. So this is an iconic building here in local Fort Myers, and we're proud that it's still standing down there. If you love history, then take a walk downtown Fort Myers and take a look at this building. Now, Ford also asked Edison to expound. Well, first of all, Henry Ford, this was the most enjoyable vacation they ever had. And this was in a letter he wrote to Edison thanking him for his hospitality on March 31st. He also asked Edison to expound upon a discussion they had about cigarette smoking and requested a letter as to the dangers for him to post in his factory. So one of their intimate discussions on their camping trip was the dangers of cigarette smoking. Even though they all enjoyed a chew once in a while and a cigar, Edison pointed out that the chemical produced by cigarette smoke comes from the burning of the paper, and that is what makes it so dangerous. So Edison did accommodate Henry Ford with the letter, and Ford proudly hung it up in his factories around the country to let people know, don't smoke, it's no good for you. So Henry Ford leaves, and this sparked a buying frenzy for Ford automobiles in DeSoto and Lee counties. They broke a record for the amount of automobiles sold. It says right here is the sales record a few weeks of the Hill Garage. J.W. Hill reports that a carload of Ford machines arrived on October 21st. This consignment has been disposed of and another carload is ordered. So they smashed all their automobile sales. And of course, Joseph Walton Hill, very happy that Henry Ford was here in town to visit. On June 1st, 2016, 2 years later, after a little bit of negotiating with Mr. Smith, Henry Ford decides that he's going to buy the property next door to Thomas Edison's house. On June 1st, the title for the mangoes was transferred to Henry Ford. This started the anticipation for locals of Ford's arrivals for his winter visits. Articles like this December 16th were often printed in the local paper and became part of an annual rumor mill about the tycoon's arrival. So now the people of Fort Myers, they can boast one of the wealthiest men on the planet visiting, not only visiting, but buying property and making this his winter home. So this begins that legacy for the people, the Fort Myers people embracing Henry Ford as one of their own. Of course, this would help bring in many other people in the future. During his 1922 visit, Henry and Thomas visited the local business district, which included an extended tour and a meeting with J.W. Hill and Edward Sykes at the Hill and Company garage on Bay Street, where the two shook hands with all the mechanics and salesmen of the local Ford dealer. Big boost for morale. I have an old picture of Hill and Sykes Company on Bay Street. This goes back to 1922. I took that out of a newspaper article for my Tamiami Trail presentation. On July 18th, 1923, as reported by the London newspaper, the Sunday Express, Henry Ford was worth $500 million, followed by Rockefeller at $450 million and Andrew Mellon at $150 million. Andrew Mellon was actually Secretary of our Treasury, so if you're wondering where he got his money from. Henry Ford, the richest man in the world. This was a Fort Myers reprint of the article, so the people of Fort Myers, even more reason to be proud. They now officially host the wealthiest man in the world right here in remote Southwest Florida. Henry and Thomas, they always enjoyed their time in town engaging with local businesses. They loved to go downtown when they were visiting here. They would visit the Mensch Brothers line of steamships, who often provided them with their favorite recreation, fishing. Now, another big news here in Southwest Florida, and this really created a huge excitement here locally when Henry Ford purchased 8,000 acres in Hendry County, put the spotlight on Florida's newest county. He did this right after Henry County was formed. His rubber plantation brought hope of economic windfall to local Southwest Floridians. And there's another picture. In 1924, it was reported that Ford invested in local Southwest Florida land, purchasing 8,200 acres in Hendry County, which included portions of downtown LaBelle. The road to Henry County in the late 20s, there it is on the left. Today it's known as State Road 80. There's a look at downtown LaBelle, owned by Henry Ford now officially. And of course, this created huge excitement in the new county. At the same time this was happening, the first Ford car factory in Florida was established in Jacksonville in 1924. Known as the Jacksonville Assembly Plant, this facility initially assembled the famous Model T, followed by Model A and V8 models. This plant, besides marking Florida's position in the automobile manufacturing scene, also set in motion the more significant growth of the auto industry in the state and around the world because they shipped a lot of cars out of their Jacksonville plant. There's an aerial view of the historic Ford Motor Company in Talleyrand, north of the Matthews Bridge. The 172,000 square foot structure was built in 1924. Henry Ford helped design the factory that produced the company's Model T and Model A cars. Assembly plant workers lined up here for a company portrait. This was taken between 1924 and 1932. I couldn't get an exact date. At its height, the plant employed more than 800 workers, churning out 200 Model T automobiles each day. So this was a huge operation, almost rivaling that of Henry Ford's up in Michigan. Not quite that big, though. Here's a picture of Henry Ford's rubber nursery in LaBelle. Interesting shot there. You can see he was trying to grow some rubber vines there. And this was the extent of that project, although the people weren't sure about that. Now, Henry loved to cater to the Edisons when in town, and here he made a special trip to the ACL depot to meet his friend Thomas Edison. So if he got here before Edison, he would go down to the train depot to greet his friend, and he would be there along with hundreds of other people. So everywhere Ford and Edison went, you can imagine they drew a crowd while they were here in Fort Myers. William H. Ross, a blacksmith, purchased tools from Edison and was using them in his shop on Henry Street for several years. Well, Mr. Ford helped crate everything up to ensure its proper treatment. Then he shipped it to his museum in Michigan, which he was in the process of building. So in 1925, Ford's going around the local area, scavenging up all the old laboratory equipment that Edison had started to get rid of. Of course, he used that laboratory for many years as a little power plant here for his property. When he stopped using that, he started to sell off the equipment, but Henry Ford had bigger ideas for Edison's equipment as he was putting together Greenfield Village, and his big plan will be unveiled here in a little bit. This is Thomas Edison with M.A. Cheek and Russell Firestone in LaBelle, Florida in 1925. So this is on some of Henry Ford's property. Ford's rubber nursery created a huge local excitement in the newly established Henry County. Real estate prices increased, and LaBelle became a sought-after destination on the Caloosahatchee River. So the big story here was there was going to be a rubber factory in LaBelle. So people started buying up property, waiting for Henry Ford's new rubber factory. And you can see lots were being offered from $300 to $600 in LaBelle. So already people are really excited. They see visions of the rubber industry right here in Southwest Florida. January 1925, Frank Campsell, Mr. Ford's personal secretary, arrived to discuss business with Hill and Sykes. This was just months before the construction of their new modern warehouse/showroom. Construction began in 1925. So Henry and Frank put a little muscle behind Hill and Sykes' dream of being the #1 automobile dealer, and it was their influence that led to that beautiful 4-story automobile shopping mall that once stood down on the corner of First Street. So that's some more influence here locally. There's a look at one of the many presents that Henry Ford would give to Thomas Edison. Gifted to his friend in February, it was used on the property for various duties. This was a Model T pickup truck. including the removal of the original laboratory. The truck was assembled at the Jacksonville plant and driven down by a special mechanic. So there's the very truck they used to dismantle the historic laboratory on our property, which would later be shipped up to Greenfield Village. Now, Ford was getting a little upset because a lot of people were starting to get impatient with Henry Ford's lack of movement out in LaBelle. Henry Ford denounced fraudulent advertisements made by realtors in Lee County boasting of a rubber factory to be built on the Ford plantation. His personal secretary in this article was quoted as saying, "There's nothing at all to the Ford rubber plantation except a nursery of about 1 acre, and there never has been." So they're worried about Henry Ford's reputation down here. Typical of the people in Lee County at the time, they're grasping at straws, trying to make a big deal out of anything that might bring in some more revenue here locally. What else did the Fords do while they were here? Well, one of their famous places was the Gondola Inn, and they dined there. They even holding a dance during a pancake party, serving up buckwheat cakes, onion soup, steak, blueberry pie, and stick candy. Originally, the restaurant was a barge outfitted as an Italian restaurant that floated on the Caloosahatchee. The whole town celebrated when Pellegrin, the owner, Frank Pellegrin, put the barge on pilings and reopened it as a riverfront restaurant on West First Street in 1930. Now, I'm not sure of the exact location, but it certainly seems like a Joe's Crab Shack type of establishment there. So somewhere on West First Street, the Gondola Inn was celebrated by all of the visitors here in Fort Myers and locals alike. As a matter of fact, on the grand opening, Mr. Pellegrin had a free spaghetti dinner for the public on the grand opening of this restaurant. So interesting side story there. You can look that up online. So when Henry Ford often visited, he'd like to do little practical jokes on the people of Fort Myers. In this particular article in the local paper, it says Henry Ford jumped off the train early to avoid the crowds at the depot on his 1929 visit. He actually got off right around where the railroad tracks are crossing MLK today, known as Anderson Boulevard back then, a little bit before the train depot further down. And he walked into town with Fred Mensch and a local reporter, and that's where this newspaper article comes from. The local reporter interviewed him on the way in. He stopped at the laboratory before he ever went to his house to visit with Edison before going to his home, and he spent 3 hours in the laboratory while Clara waited for him over at the winter bungalow. So interesting. Henry Ford loved to visit that laboratory. He paid for it after all, so why wouldn't he want to be hanging out in there? Here's a picture of Ford and Firestone, along with President-elect Hoover. They all came here in 1929 to celebrate Thomas Edison's birthday, along with 25,000 locals. This was a big event, printed up in the paper days before the party ever happened. Last minute changes had the people a little confused when President Hoover trashed his plan to come up the brand new Tamiami Trail and instead decided to arrive by boat, dock at the Edison Pier on our property, participate in a birthday lunch here at the estate before the parade. So this was big news. 25,000 people lined the streets to cheer on the famous celebrities here in Fort Myers. Harvey Fire, in this picture we have, it's Harvey Firestone, Mina Edison, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford at Fort Myers City Park on Edison's 83rd birthday. They dedicated a plaque. Mina gave a speech to the people that day. Thousands of people gathered, and that was his 1930 birthday. We also have a picture of the parade preceding that, and there's Henry Ford in a beautiful Lincoln, I believe, participating in Edison's birthday parade. So Henry Ford, very high profile. The people of Fort Myers really love him, along with Thomas Edison. Some of the things he would do here, well, he came down late, missed Edison's birthday, his final birthday, that where Edison dedicated the bridge across the Caloosahatchee, but he finally gets here February 21st, 1931. Henry arrived just in time for some fun in the sun. He visited Sanibel Island. Mr. Ford didn't let a 2-hour wait at the ferry to get back across to the mainland dampen his visit. And in this article, it says right here, "Is there any water around here?" the auto magnate asked when he had finished. "I don't know about that," someone ventured. "You may have to take booze." And Henry Ford's reply was, "I'll dig a well first." That was a rejoinder of the ardent advocate of prohibition. He quenched his thirst with a bottled drink. Mr. Ford has already confided that he was never able to drink liquor because it made him sick. He did not say that was the reason he is satisfied with prohibition. So Henry Ford never loses a chance to make a statement about his values, and he took advantage of it here while waiting to get on the ferry at Sanibel Island. So the other thing he did in 1931 is he continued to gather more artifacts for his museum up in Detroit. Actually, he went, including 2 machines from the Koreans. He went down to the Korean village and got 2 generators for his museum down there. He loved to visit the Koreans. He thought them a very interesting group of people. When Henry Ford did arrive, there's a look at his private rail car. So he came in luxury. After arriving on February 20th, Ford left after his active 1931 winter vacation. He visited Sanibel, Estero, and the Korean Unity site. Now, when Henry was here, it wasn't just Thomas Edison. He also developed a strong friendship with the Mensch brothers during his winter visits in Fort Myers. The brothers built a replica of the Swanee, a paddle wheel steamboat that once plied the Caloosahatchee, Thomas Edison's favorite boat to charter while he was a visitor here. The Mensch, and it actually sank out in Lake Okeechobee. Henry Ford paid the Mensches to exhume it up out of the mud, put it back together, put an engine in it, and then they actually cut the boat in half and shipped it up to Dearborn and reassembled it up there. And that steamboat was put back to use up in Michigan. Now, the Mensch family eventually moved to Dearborn to work for Ford. Fred Mensch and Henry competed in an annual foot race during his Fort Myers visits. Conrad Mensch and Henry both had a love of music. They both fiddled around, you might say, with the violin. And the Mensch family actually extremely musically inclined. Their entire family gave local concerts here. Look for my Mensch Brothers presentation on YouTube and you can learn all about that. So there's a look at the Swanee, the steamboat, and you can see to the left, that was the original Swanee up in Michigan. Henry Ford thought it was an ugly boat, so he coaxed Conrad Mensch to rebuild it, and you can see the picture on the right was the rebuilt version of the Swanee. And there's a picture of Fred and Conrad Mensch up in Michigan. They were at a board of directors meeting on that picture for the Henry Ford Museum. So they became very close friends with Henry. As a matter of fact, Conrad Mensch spent his entire life up there docenting at the Ford Museum until his death. Fred actually moved back down to Florida. What else did Henry Ford do? Well, he never misses an opportunity for a nice little write-up in the paper. He helped a local boy here. Clyde Underhill was a local delivery man, and he approached Henry Ford. He knocked on his door with an envelope of mail for Henry, and Henry asked Clyde what kind of car he would purchase if he had $1,000. While he was holding $1,000 out to Clyde, Clyde responded that he would use the money to go to school instead. Mr. Ford took him to Dearborn, where he studied electricity for 2 years. He came back here and put his education to use here locally for many years. I did find his obituary there. He died in a Miami hotel, unfortunately. We're not sure what he died from, but he was found dead in his room at the Hotel Maryland here early yesterday morning. Says he died of natural causes. He was a cab driver in Miami for the past 15 years. He was born in LaBelle in 1911, but Henry Ford did change his life by that act of kindness. The local boy is making good as Henry Ford's protege in a Detroit factory. So Henry loved to do random acts of kindness for local people here from time to time. Mr. and Mrs. Ford arrived incognito on February 16th, 1934. Wasn't really advertised as their other visits were. They were driven to their winter home in a brand new Ford purchased by Henry. While here, Henry had his picture taken with Connie Mack at Terry Park. You can see that picture there. Now, Henry Ford wasn't really a baseball fan, but feeling nostalgic about his good friend Thomas Edison's love for baseball and Terry Park, Henry Ford made an appearance and got his picture taken with the famous general manager of the Oakland Athletics. Now, of course, Thomas Edison passes away in 1931, and the luster of Southwest Florida had worn off, and Henry Ford began a liquidation process, if you will, the first of which was selling off his 8,000 plus acre ranch out in LaBelle. He sold it to Joseph Bartholomew Joel Henry Sr. So the Hendry family back in charge of what was rightfully theirs. They get Fort Thompson. Mr. Goodnow, who made his living out there in Punta Rassa, remained the manager of the ranch for the temporary time being. Says here, Mr. Henry and Glades County, Mr. Henry and Henry Ford made this deal on October 31st, 1942. So Ford sells the ranch. He's out of that business once and for all. In 1945, Henry Ford decides to sell his home, his winter estate here, and very generously offers it up to Tom Bigger, a local farmer, prominent citizen here in Fort Myers, and the deal is done. The Bigger family takes over Henry Ford's winter estate, and they hang on to this. It says there $21,500, and I often wondered why we say it's 20,000. So what I found out was someone had to pick up the closing cost. The handshake deal was 20,000, but there was $1,500 in closing costs. After all, Henry Ford was selling this property for the same price he bought it for back in 1916. A very generous offer, and the Biggers held on to it. Now, the Biggers lived there till 1988. And then at the end of Mrs. Bigger's life, Thomas had already passed away. They decide that the city of Fort Myers should have the property. And this was a long, drawn out, after a 7-month negotiation with the Bigger family, the city was able to purchase the Ford estate. The Bigger's son tried to get an extra $1 million, saying the city took advantage of his 88-year-old mother. She agreed to sell it for $1.5 million to the people of Fort Myers. And just to give you an idea of the people of Fort Myers and Henry Ford's relationship, they jumped on this deal. They wanted this property. They wanted to continue Ford's legacy. They eventually would make it part of the Edison estate, also part of the museum. In 1990, the Ford home and property opened up as its own museum. People lined the streets down McGregor to get in on the opening day of that. And Ford's legacy would now be cemented forever here in Fort Myers as it became part of our property, and people come here. It's the most visited attraction in Fort Myers to this day. So we are very proud that the people of Fort Myers have helped us maintain this property here, and without their help, it wouldn't be possible. All of our volunteers that help us, all the local people, the schools that come here to visit. It's just an amazing thing that the community of Fort Myers has continued Henry Ford's legacy. So it is truly a legacy for the people. And Fort Myers has made Edison and Ford their identity in many ways, for good or bad or indifferent. That's how it is. And I am grateful that you took 30 minutes of your day to listen to my presentation. Thank you for joining me this morning. Have a great day.